There's a kind of silence that lives on military bases, not the quiet of empty rooms or sleeping towns. This silence breathes. It watches. It knows who belongs and who is pretending. And sooner or later, it swallows pretenders whole. This is the story of a woman who walked onto one of the most elite military installations in the United States, looked trained operators dead in the eye, and told them she was one of them. She said she had earned the trident. She said she had bled for it. She wore it on her chest like it was hers. It was not hers. And what happened next did not just embarrass her. It cracked open something ugly and fascinating about what people will do when they are desperate enough to become someone they are not. About how far a lie can carry you before the ground disappears beneath your feet. About a community so tight, so earned through suffering, that a single wrong word can unravel a decade of deception in under 40 seconds. Before you hear what happened on that base, you need to understand something. The Navy SEAL Trident is not a badge. It is not a rank. It is not a piece of metal you buy at a surplus store and pin to your jacket. Every single person who wears that trident has been broken down to nothing and rebuilt from the inside out. They've been dragged through freezing surf at 2 in the morning while instructors screamed at them to quit. They have held their breath underwater until their vision went black. They have carried logs and boats and brothers on their backs through sand that swallowed their knees. 80% of the men who attempt basic underwater demolition SEAL training do not finish. They ring a bell. They walk away. There is no shame in it. The program is designed to find the ones who simply will not stop, no matter what their bodies or their minds are screaming at them. The ones who make it through do not talk about it at parties. They do not brag about it on social media. They do not introduce themselves as SEALs at barbecues. The real ones carry it quiet. It lives in the way they stand, the way they scan a room when they walk in, the way they answer questions about their service with as few words as possible. The community is small, tight. Everyone knows everyone, or knows someone who knows someone. There is no corner of that world where a stranger can hide for long, which makes what this woman did either the bravest or the most foolish thing anyone had attempted in years. Maybe both. Her name, for the purposes of this story, does not matter as much as what she built around it. She had constructed an identity so detailed, so layered, so polished that it fooled people who should have known better. She had documents. She had stories. She had the vocabulary, the acronyms, the references to specific training evolutions that only someone on the inside would know. She had been doing her homework for a long time. Years, probably. She had studied the culture the way a method actor studies a role, absorbing the language and the posture and the quiet confidence until it sat on her like a second skin. She first appeared on the radar of a small veterans organization in the southwestern United States. She showed up at a fundraiser wearing a black polo shirt with an embroidered trident on the chest. Her hair was pulled tight. Her posture was rigid. She shook hands like she meant it, palm dry, grip firm, 2 pumps, and release. She made eye contact that lasted exactly the right amount of time. Not too long, not too short. She had practiced this. The people at that fundraiser were mostly retired military. Some Army, some Marines, a few Air Force veterans who spent their weekends helping raise money for wounded warriors. They welcomed her with open arms. A female SEAL. That was rare. That was historic. The SEAL teams had only recently opened their doors to women, and the idea that one had already made it through, already earned the trident, already deployed, and returned with stories to tell, it was electric. People wanted to shake her hand. People wanted to buy her drinks. People wanted to hear everything. And she gave them everything. She talked about BUD/S training like she had lived it. She described the cold water, the sand in places sand should never be, the feeling of your lungs burning during underwater, not tying exercises. She talked about Hell Week with the specific exhaustion of someone who had actually survived it. She described the hallucinations that come on day 4, when your body has been awake for so long that your brain starts inventing things to look at. She said she saw a horse standing on the beach at 3 in the morning and tried to ride it before her swim buddy pulled her back. People laughed. People leaned in. People believed. She talked about deployments she had never been on to countries she had never visited, doing work she had never done. She was careful. She never named specific missions. She never dropped classified details. She framed everything in a language of secrecy that real operators use. I cannot talk about that. That is above your clearance. You understand how it is. And people nodded because they did understand, or they thought they did. Over the next several months, she became a fixture in the veterans community. She attended events. She spoke on panels. She was invited to mentorship programs where she advised young women considering military careers. She told them the path was hard, but possible. She told them she was living proof. She told them the teams would try to break them, and that they should let themselves be broken because what gets rebuilt is stronger than what was there before. It was beautiful advice. Inspiring. Completely stolen from motivational speeches she had memorized from actual SEAL instructors whose talks were posted on the internet. Nobody checked. That was the thing. For months, nobody checked. And why would they? She was articulate. She was convincing. She carried herself with the kind of quiet authority that people associate with special operations. She did not boast. She did not showboat. She offered details only when asked and deflected attention with a humble shrug that felt so authentic it made people trust her more. The veterans organizations she moved through are built on trust. When someone says they served, the default is belief. The community does not demand DD 214s at the door. They do not run background checks on every person who walks in wearing unit patch. They operate on honor. And she exploited that honor like it was a skeleton key. She began collecting things. Not physical things, though those came too. Free meals, donated gear, gift cards from grateful civilians. She collected access. She collected credibility. She collected introductions to people who could open doors that should have remained locked. Each event led to another invitation. Each handshake led to another connection. She was building a network, and she was building it fast. The money started flowing around month 4. She launched what she called a nonprofit, dedicated to supporting women in special operations. The website was clean and professional. The mission statement was heartfelt. The donation page worked perfectly. Money came in from civilians who wanted to support the cause, from corporations who wanted the optics of backing female warriors, from other veterans organizations who transferred funds believing they were supporting a sister in arms. The money did not go where it was supposed to go. She spent it, not all at once. She was too smart for that. She siphoned it in small amounts, covering her rent, her car payments, her wardrobe of military-adjacent clothing that kept the illusion alive. She bought tactical gear she did not need and wore it to events like a costume. She booked hotel rooms for conferences she organized and then billed the nonprofit for suites she stayed in alone, ordering room service, and watching movies while donors believed their money was changing lives. It was a grift, a clean, patient, well-constructed grift. And it might have worked forever if she had not made the one mistake that every pretender eventually makes. She got greedy, not for money, for glory. She accepted an invitation to visit an active military installation. Not just any installation. A base where actual SEAL teams trained and operated. A base where the men and women who had truly earned the trident lived and worked and bled. A base where her lie would not be tested by grateful civilians or trusting veterans at fundraisers. It would be tested by the real thing. The invitation came through a connection she had made at a high-profile charity gala. A retired officer who still maintained close ties with the active duty community. He was impressed by her. He wanted to introduce her to the current generation. He thought it would be good for morale. A woman who had made it through, coming back to show the new recruits what was possible. She should have said no. Every survival instinct she possessed should have fired at once, screaming at her to decline, to make an excuse, to say she was deployed or injured or out of the country. She had built the perfect lie for the civilian world. The civilian world did not ask hard questions. The civilian world did not have access to personnel databases. The civilian world wanted to believe her because believing her felt good. The military world was different. The military world was a closed system with closed records, and closed mouths, and the kind of institutional memory that stretches back decades. Someone would know someone. Someone would check something. Someone would ask a question that had no right answer except the truth, and the truth was the one thing she could not give. She said yes. She said yes because by that point, she had been living inside the lie for so long that the walls between performance and identity had started to dissolve. She believed it. Not fully. Not in the logical part of her brain that still knew she had never set foot in Coronado, never touched the cold Pacific at midnight, never heard an instructor's voice breaking through the fog of exhaustion, telling her to quit. But in a part of her brain that had rehearsed the stories so many times they had worn grooves in her memory, she believed it the way an actor believes in the character after 1,000 performances. The role had consumed the person. She arrived at the base on a Tuesday morning. The sky was that flat military gray that makes everything look like a photograph from a training manual. She was wearing pressed khakis and a polo shirt with no trident this time. She had been smart enough to dress down. She carried a small bag with a leather portfolio inside, the kind officers carry to briefings. She had business cards. They listed her name, her fake rank, and the acronym of her fake nonprofit. The gate guards checked her ID. She had a visitor pass arranged through the retired officer who had invited her. The pass was legitimate. It had been processed through proper channels. She was expected. She drove onto the base and parked in a visitor lot near the administrative buildings. The base was alive with the organized chaos of military life. Trucks moving, personnel jogging in formation, the distant crack of gunfire from a range somewhere behind the tree line. She sat in her car for 3 minutes before getting out. She was breathing in a pattern, 4 counts in, 4 counts hold, 4 counts out. Box breathing. She had learned it from a YouTube video about stress management for operators. The retired officer met her in the parking lot. He was tall, gray at the temples, with a permanent squint of a man who had spent too many years looking through scopes and into sun. He shook her hand and told her how glad he was that she could make it. He said the guys were excited to meet her. He said the commanding officer had cleared her for a tour and an informal talk with some of the newer team members. She smiled. She thanked him. Her voice was steady. Her hands were dry. She had prepared for this the way she prepared for everything. Obsessively, meticulously, with the focus of someone who understands that a single wrong detail can collapse an entire architecture of deception. They walked toward a building that looked like every other building on the base. Beige, functional, the architectural equivalent of a blank stare. Inside, the hallways smelled like floor wax and coffee. There were framed photographs on the walls. Team photos, deployment photos, memorial photos of operators who had not come home. She glanced at them as she walked past and felt something that might have been guilt, or might have been the ghost of guilt, or might have been nothing at all. They entered a conference room where a dozen men were waiting. Some sat. Some stood against the walls with their arms crossed. They were not in dress uniforms. They wore operational clothing, the kind of practical, broken-in gear that comes from actual use rather than catalog purchases. Their faces were calm, but watchful. They had the relaxed alertness of people who assess threats for a living. The retired officer introduced her. He gave her name, her supposed background, her supposed accomplishments. He mentioned her nonprofit. He mentioned her BUD/S class number, a detail she had given him weeks ago, a number she had pulled from publicly available records of a class that had graduated years earlier. The room was polite. A few nods, a few tight smiles. Someone in the back shifted his weight from one foot to the other. She began to speak. She thanked them for having her. She talked about the importance of mentorship, of keeping the SEAL community connected across generations. She talked about the challenges women faced in special operations and how the culture was evolving. She was articulate. She was composed. She hit every note she had rehearsed. Then, a man in the second row asked her a question. It was a simple question, the kind of question that would mean nothing to a civilian. He asked her about a specific instructor at BUD/S. He used a nickname, not the instructor's real name. A nickname that the students had given this particular instructor a nickname that lived only inside the walls of the Naval Special Warfare Center, passed down from class to class like oral tradition. She paused. The pause was 1 second too long. She recovered. She smiled and said something vague about remembering him differently, about how instructors blurred together during Hell Week, about how her memory of that period was fragmented by exhaustion. It was a reasonable answer. It was the kind of answer a real graduate might give. But the man who asked the question did not blink. He did not nod. He looked at her the way a mechanic looks at an engine that is making a sound it should not be making. Another man asked a question. This one was about a specific phase of training, a specific exercise, a specific location on the beach where a specific evolution took place. He described it in terms that were technically accurate, but contained a deliberate error, a wrong detail planted like a tripwire. She stepped on it. She agreed with the detail. She confirmed something that was not true, something that anyone who had actually been there would have corrected without thinking. It was a small thing, a direction, left instead of right, north instead of south, the kind of mistake that means nothing to the world and everything to the people in that room. The air changed. It did not change the way air changes in movies, with dramatic music and slow-motion glances. It changed the way air changes in a room full of professionals who have just confirmed what they already suspected. Quietly, completely, like a thermostat clicking over from warm to cold. The temperature dropped 10 degrees without anyone touching a dial. She felt it. She had to have felt it. The smiles thinned. The crossed arms tightened. The man in the back who had been shifting his weight went still. The retired officer, standing near the door, looked at the faces in the room and understood something was wrong. He did not yet know what. He cleared his throat and suggested they continue the tour. He put his hand on her elbow, a gentle steering motion, and guided her toward the door. They walked out of the conference room and into the hallway. Behind them, the room did not erupt. It did not explode with anger or accusation. It went quiet. That silence, the one that lives on military bases, the one that breathes and watches and knows. It had found her, and now was following her down the hallway, patient and certain like something that had all the time in the world. Because it did. The retired officer walked beside her, making small talk about the next stop on the tour. He pointed out a training facility through a window. He mentioned a recent renovation to the obstacle course. His voice was easy and conversational, and he had no idea that behind them, in the room they had just left, a phone had already been picked up. A text message was already being sent. A name was already being run. The machine was waking up. Not the bureaucratic machine of paperwork and process. The other machine, the informal one. The network of operators and veterans and intelligence professionals who protect their community the way wolves protect their pack. Not with laws, but with teeth. She was still smiling as they walked toward the training facility. She was still talking about her nonprofit, about upcoming events, about the young women she was supposedly mentoring. She had no idea that she had approximately 90 minutes left. 90 minutes before the phone calls reached the right people. 90 minutes before the database searches returned their results. 90 minutes before the BUD/S class number she had claimed was cross-referenced with actual graduation records, and her name appeared nowhere. 90 minutes before the entire base went quiet. Not the normal quiet of a Tuesday afternoon. A different quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when every single person in a community learns the same piece of information at the same time and makes the same decision without speaking a word to each other. She was still walking, still smiling, still performing the role of a lifetime. The hallway stretched ahead of her, long and beige and institutional, and she did not know yet that it was not leading her deeper into the base. It was leading her toward the end of everything she had built. The training facility smelled like rubber mats and old sweat, the kind of smell that seeps into walls and never leaves no matter how much industrial cleaner you pour on it. She stood in the doorway with the retired officer beside her, looking out at a space designed to break human beings into their smallest parts and see what was left. Climbing ropes hung from steel beams 30 feet above the concrete floor. Pull-up bars were worn smooth and silver from thousands of hands gripping them until their palms bled. In a corner, a rack of kettlebells sat in ascending order like a metal staircase leading nowhere good. She made a comment about how the facility had been updated since her time. She said it with the casual authority of someone comparing a remodeled kitchen to the one they remembered. The retired officer nodded and pointed out the new flooring, the upgraded rigging system, the digital tracking boards that monitored each trainee's performance metrics in real time. She absorbed every detail, filed it away, added it to the expanding library of authenticity she carried in her head. This is what she did. She collected truths and wore them like armor, layering real details over fabricated experience until the patchwork became seamless. She had been doing this for so long that the process was automatic like breathing. While she stood there admiring the climbing ropes, three things were happening simultaneously in different parts of the base. The first thing was a text message conversation happening between the man who had asked about the instructor nickname and a buddy of his who worked in personnel records. The text was short, just a name and a BUD/S class number and a question mark. The buddy in personnel said give him 10 minutes. The second thing was a phone call from another man in that conference room to a retired master chief who had been an instructor during the class she claimed to have graduated from. The master chief was at home in Virginia Beach, drinking coffee and watching his dog dig holes in the backyard. He answered the phone on the second ring. He listened. He said no. He said that name had never been in his class. He said he remembered every single person in every single class he had ever trained, and that name was not one of them. He did not say this with anger. He said it with the flat certainty of a man stating that the sky is blue. The third thing was a quiet conversation between two team guys in the hallway outside the conference room. They were leaning against the wall with their hands in their pockets, speaking in low voices. One of them had already pulled up her nonprofit website on his phone. He was scrolling through it, reading the mission statement, looking at the photos, checking the registration details. The nonprofit was registered. It had a tax ID number. It looked real, but the team photo on the About page showed her standing with a group of veterans at a charity event, and one of the men looking at the phone recognized two of the people in that photo. He knew them. He knew they were Army, not Navy. He knew they had no connection to special operations. He knew the event in the photo was an open fundraiser where anyone could walk in off the street and stand next to whoever they wanted. The details were not adding up. They were the kind of details that civilians would never notice, the kind that only matter to people who live inside the world she was pretending to inhabit. A wrong unit patch in a photo. A class number that did not match a graduation date. An instructor nickname met with a blank stare instead of instant recognition. Each detail alone meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern. And the men on that base were trained to recognize patterns the way most people recognize faces, instantly, instinctively, without needing to explain how they knew. She was still on the tour. The retired officer was still talking. They had moved from the training facility to an outdoor area where obstacle course components were arranged across a sandy stretch of ground. She looked at the obstacles and made comments about specific ones, naming them correctly, describing the techniques used to navigate them. She had studied this. She had watched videos, read books, memorized the names and the methods. Her knowledge was encyclopedic, but knowledge and experience are different animals entirely. Knowledge lives in the brain. Experience lives in the body, in the hands, in the way a person's weight shifts when they approach a familiar obstacle. It lives in the small, unconscious adjustments that cannot be faked because they were never learned, they were earned. 1,000 repetitions carve them into muscle and bone. She looked at the obstacles the way a tourist looks at a monument, with admiration, with interest, with the unmistakable distance of someone who is seeing something for the first time and trying very hard to pretend otherwise. A young operator approached from across the sand. He was in his late 20s, compact and coiled, with the economical movements of someone who has trained his body to waste nothing. He wore a faded t-shirt and running shorts and had clearly just finished a workout. His face was neutral. He introduced himself. She shook his hand. He asked her which class she had graduated from. She told him. He nodded and said his buddy had been 2 classes behind her. He asked if she had known a specific person from a neighboring class, someone who had gone on to a notable career in the teams. She said the name sounded familiar, but she could not place the face. She blamed it on the years. She said everything from that period was a blur. The young operator said he understood. He said training had a way of scrambling your memory. He smiled. The smile did not reach his eyes. He excused himself and walked back the way he had come, pulling his phone from his pocket before he was 10 steps away. The net was tightening. She could not see it, could not feel its edges closing around her, but it was there. Every conversation she had on that base was being relayed, cross-referenced, verified. The informal network of operators was doing what it does best, processing information at speed, sharing intelligence through channels that have no official name, reaching consensus without a single meeting or memo. The retired officer suggested they grab lunch at the base dining facility. She agreed. They walked across the base in the midday heat, past parked vehicles and jogging formations and a group of trainees carrying a boat on their heads. She watched the trainees and felt something stir in her chest, something she had taught herself to interpret as nostalgia, but was actually envy. She had never carried that boat. She had never felt the weight of it pressing down on her skull while her shoulders screamed and her knees buckled, and the instructor told her she could stop any time. Just ring the bell, just ring it. She had never chosen not to ring it. And that choice, that specific moment of deciding to keep going when every cell in your body is begging you to stop, was the thing she could never fake. It was the thing that separated her from every person on this base. Not the trident, not the training, the choice. The dining facility was loud with the clatter of trays and the hum of conversation. She got in line, grabbed a tray, selected her food with the practiced indifference of someone who has eaten in 100 military dining facilities. She had, in fact, eaten in military dining facilities before. Just not this kind. She had been in the military. That part was true. She had served. She had worn the uniform. She had deployed, but she had never been anywhere near special operations. She had been support staff, administrative, important work, necessary work, but not the work she claimed. That was the thing that made her different from the typical imposter. Most people who fake military service have never served a day in their lives. They buy uniforms at surplus stores and pins on the internet, and they construct fantasies from movies and video games. They're easy to spot because they get everything wrong. The terminology, the bearing, the 1,000 small customs and courtesies that become second nature after basic training. She got most of it right because she had lived the military life, just not the version she was selling. She knew how dining facilities worked. She knew the rhythms of base life. She knew the language. She just did not know the specific, insular, intensely guarded language of the teams. And that gap, narrow as it was the gap that was about to swallow her. They sat at a table near the window. The retired officer ate and talked about upcoming events, about a memorial service for a fallen operator next month, about a golf tournament fundraiser in the spring. She listened and nodded and made appropriate sounds of interest. She was running on autopilot now, the performance so practiced that it required almost no conscious effort. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She ignored it. It buzzed again. She excused herself and checked it under the table. It was a message from someone in her network, another veteran she had connected with at a fundraiser months ago. The message was short. It said, "Someone is asking questions about you." She read it twice. Her face did not change. She put the phone back in her pocket and picked up her fork and took a bite of mashed potatoes that tasted like library paste. "Someone is asking questions about you." 6 words. The mashed potatoes turned to cement in her mouth. She chewed. She swallowed. She took a drink of water. She looked at the retired officer and said something about the food being better than she remembered. He laughed. She did not know who was asking or what they were finding. She did not know that by this point, the Master Chief in Virginia Beach had already made 3 more phone calls. She did not know that the personnel records search had come back empty. She did not know that her nonprofit's financial records were being pulled by someone who knew someone at the IRS. She did not know that a photograph of her from the fundraiser was being circulated in a group chat with 47 members, all of them current or former operators, and that the caption under the photo was a single word: fake. The word moved through the network like a signal flare. It reached people on the base where she was sitting. It reached people on other bases, in other states, in other countries. It reached people who were deployed, and people who were retired, and people who were sitting in offices, and people who were standing in checkout lines at grocery stores. Within 20 minutes of that single word being typed into a group chat, over 200 people knew her name, her face, and her lie. The SEAL community does not have a formal process for dealing with imposters. There is no tribunal. There is no court-martial for civilians pretending to be something they are not. Stolen valor, in many cases, is not even a crime in the technical legal sense, depending on the jurisdiction and the specific nature of the deception. What the community has instead is something older and more effective than any legal process. It has shame, and it was about to deploy shame against her with the precision of a guided missile. Back at the dining facility, the retired officer's phone rang. He looked at the screen, and his expression shifted. Not dramatically, just a tightening around the eyes, a slight flattening of the mouth. The kind of micro-expression that most people would miss, but that she should have caught if she were truly who she claimed to be. Operators read faces the way musicians read sheet music, automatically, constantly, without conscious effort. She did not notice. She was looking at her mashed potatoes. He excused himself to take the call. He stepped outside the dining facility and stood in the sun with his back to the window. She could see him through the glass. She could see his posture change as he listened. His shoulders drew back. His free hand, which had been relaxed at his side, curled into a fist that he held against his thigh. He turned his head slightly and looked back through the window at her, and in that single glance she should have seen everything she needed to see. She was picking at her green beans. He ended the call and stood outside for another 30 seconds, staring at the ground. Then he came back inside and sat down across from her and folded his hands on the table. His face was different now. The warmth was gone. The easy conversational energy that had carried the morning was gone. What replaced it was something controlled and cold, the professional restraint of a man who is furious but has spent decades learning how to channel fury into discipline. He said they needed to talk. She looked up from her tray. Her fork was still in her hand, a piece of green beans speared on the tines. He said he had just received a phone call. He said the phone call was about her. He said the things he had been told were very serious, and he wanted to give her an opportunity to address them directly before this went any further. The dining facility continued its noise around them. Trays clattering, people laughing. Someone dropped a glass, and it shattered on the tile floor, and a few people clapped the way military people always clap when someone drops something, that sarcastic little round of applause that is its own tradition. She put her fork down. He asked her a question. He did not ask if she was a SEAL. He did not ask if she had graduated from BUD/S. He asked something more specific, more surgical. He asked her to name the officer in charge of her training class. Not the BUD/S class, she had claimed. Her actual training class. The one she would have attended when she first entered the Navy. It was a pivot, a redirection. He was not asking her to defend the lie anymore. He was asking her to tell the truth instead. He was giving her an exit ramp, a chance to come clean on her own terms, to say the words herself before someone else said them for her. She stared at him for 4 seconds. 4 seconds is a long time when someone is looking at you and waiting for an answer, and the answer will determine whether you walk out of this building with any dignity at all. She started to speak. She started to construct another layer of the lie, another deflection, another vague reference to classified information and operational security and things she could not discuss. The words were forming in her mouth, familiar and comfortable, the same words that had carried her through 100 conversations with 100 people who had believed her. But Something in his eyes stopped her. He knew. She could see that he knew. Not suspected. Knew. With the absolute certainty of someone who has received confirmed intelligence from multiple independent sources. He was not asking because he needed the answer. He was asking because he wanted her to hear herself say it. She closed her mouth. She opened it again. She said she could explain. He said he was sure she could. He said she had clearly been explaining things very well for a very long time. He said that was the problem. The dining facility felt smaller. The noise felt louder. The walls felt closer. She was aware of her own breathing in a way she had not been since she first started this, since the first time she pinned on a trident that did not belong to her, and walked into a room full of people who took her at her word. He stood up. He told her that several members of the team had already verified that she had never attended BUD/S, had never been assigned to any SEAL team, had never held the rating or the qualification she claimed. He told her that her nonprofit was being looked into and that the financial irregularities were going to become someone else's problem very soon. He told her that she needed to leave the base immediately and that her visitor pass was being revoked. He said all of this without raising his voice. He said it the way a surgeon describes a procedure. Clinical, precise, with no more emotion than the task requires. She did not argue. That surprised him. He had expected denial, deflection, maybe tears. He had prepared himself for a performance, one more act in a show that had been running for years. Instead, she picked up her tray, carried it to the conveyor belt by the kitchen window, set it down, and walked toward the door. Her hands were shaking. She could feel the tremor starting in her fingers and working its way up her arms, and she pressed her palms flat against her thighs as she walked, trying to hold herself still from the outside in. The door was 20 steps away. 15. 10. She could feel eyes on her. Not everyone in the dining facility knew what had just happened, but some did. The ones who knew were watching her walk with the particular attention of people witnessing something they will talk about later. She reached the door and pushed it open, and the sunlight hit her face like a flashbulb. She stood on a concrete step and blinked, and for one disoriented moment, she did not know which direction the parking lot was. The retired officer appeared behind her. He did not touch her arm this time. He walked beside her with 3 feet of space between them, the precise distance of someone who is escorting rather than accompanying. The difference would have been invisible to a camera, but it was enormous to anyone who understood the language of military body mechanics. They walked across the base in silence. The same route they had taken that morning, past the same buildings and vehicles and jogging formations. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt the same. The base had shifted around her. She was no longer a guest. She was a foreign body, and the immune system had identified her, and the rejection was already underway. When they reached the parking lot, he stopped. She stopped. They stood beside her car in the flat gray light, and he looked at her with an expression that was not angry, and was not sad, and was not disgusted. It was tired. The specific tiredness of a man who has spent his life defending something sacred and has just watched someone try to steal it for profit. He told her she should consider getting a lawyer. He told her the financial aspect of what she had done was likely criminal and that the people who had donated to her nonprofit were going to want answers. He told her that the SEAL community had a long memory and that whatever anonymity she had enjoyed was over. She nodded. She got her car. She put the key in the ignition, and her hand was still shaking, and it took her 2 tries to turn it. The engine caught, and she sat there with her hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, staring through the windshield at the beige buildings of a base she never should have entered. She drove to the gate. The guards checked her out. The process took longer than it should have. The guard looked at her pass, looked at his screen, looked at her. He made a phone call. He looked at his screen again. Then he handed the pass back and waved her through with the mechanical courtesy of someone following orders he does not need to understand. She drove off the base and onto the highway and merged into traffic and became anonymous again, just another car in a stream of cars, just another person in a world of people, and the base grew smaller in her rearview mirror until it disappeared behind a curve in the road. Behind her, on the base, the quiet was spreading. Word had reached the commanding officer. Word had reached the public affairs office. Word had reached the legal department. Word had reached every building and every office and every training area on the installation. People were talking in low voices. People were shaking their heads. People were pulling up her nonprofit website and her social media profiles and her photographs from veterans events and spreading them across screens like evidence on a detective's desk. The group chat with 47 members had grown to over 100. Screenshots were being shared. Donation receipts were being collected. People who had given money to her nonprofit were being contacted and informed. People who had invited her to speak at events were being told what they had actually been hosting. The exposure was systematic, thorough, not vengeful, at least not primarily. The community was not lashing out. It was cauterizing. It was identifying every point of contact between her deception and their world and severing it cleanly, the way a surgeon removes infected tissue to save the body. Within 24 hours, her nonprofit website went dark. Whether she took it down herself or whether someone else made it happen was unclear. What was clear was that the digital footprint she had spent years building was being dismantled piece by piece. Event organizers removed her from their websites. Speaking engagements were canceled. The mentorship programs she had participated in sent quiet emails to the young women she had advised, informing them that their mentor had misrepresented her credentials. Those emails were careful and measured, and they still landed like grenades. The young women who had looked up to her, who had listened to her stories about surviving BUD/S and fighting through the barriers of gender and special operations, who had drawn courage from her example and used it to fuel their own ambitions. Those women felt the specific betrayal of discovering that the person who inspired them was made of smoke. Some of them were angry. Some were devastated. One of them, a college junior who had been training for months to attempt a military career in special operations, sat in her dorm room and stared at the wall and wondered if anything she had been told was real. She did not cry. She was not the crying type. She was the type who channeled pain into effort, who used anger as fuel, who took every obstacle as evidence that she was on the right path. That quality, that specific stubborn refusal to be broken, was something the imposter had talked about in her speeches. She had described it as the core trait of a SEAL, the one thing that separated those who made it from those who did not. She had been right about that, at least. The irony was thick enough to choke on. Back on the base, the quiet had settled into something permanent. Not silence. The base still operated, still trained, still functioned with the precise mechanical rhythm of a military installation. But underneath the normal sounds, there was a new frequency, a vibration of awareness, of alertness, of a community that had been infiltrated and had expelled the intruder and was now running a full systems check to make sure there were no others. The retired officer who had brought her onto the base sat in his office with his door closed. His phone was on the desk in front of him, and it had not stopped vibrating since lunch. People were calling to ask what happened. People were calling to ask how she had gotten in. People were calling because they had met her at events and believed her and given her money, and they wanted to know how this could have happened. He did not have good answers. He had believed her too. He had looked at her and seen what he wanted to see, a pioneer, a trailblazer, a woman who had shattered one of the last glass ceilings in the American military. He had introduced her to his community and vouched for her and opened doors for her that should have required more than his word to open. He felt responsible, not legally, perhaps, but in the deeper sense of a man who understands that trust, once extended on someone else's behalf, becomes your debt when that trust is violated. He had given her his credibility, and she had spent it like loose change. The anger would come later. Right now, sitting in his office with his door closed and his phone buzzing on the desk, he felt something worse than anger. He felt foolish. And for a man who had spent 30 years in the most elite military organization on Earth, feeling foolish was a wound that cut deeper than any shrapnel. The investigation that followed was not a single event, but a slow unraveling, like pulling a thread from a sweater and watching the entire garment come apart row by row. Every connection she had made was traced. Every dollar she had collected was tracked. Every story she had told was checked against reality and found to be constructed from fragments of other people's truths, reassembled into a fiction so convincing that it had fooled professionals whose entire careers were built on detecting deception. She had been good. That was the uncomfortable truth that nobody wanted to say out loud, but everybody was thinking. She had been really, really good. Her research was impeccable. Her performance was flawless in 99% of situations. She had fooled people who should have been unfoolable, and she had done it not with technology or documents or any sophisticated tools of deception. She had done it with confidence and homework and the fundamental human desire to believe that the person standing in front of you is who they say they are. That desire, the one to believe, was the vulnerability she had exploited. Not stupidity, not carelessness. Trust, the basic, essential, irreplaceable trust that holds a community together. And she had used it like a lockpick. The first news article appeared 11 days after she drove off the base. A military affairs journalist who had been tipped off by someone in the community published a mid-length piece on a defense news website. The article was measured and factual, and it named her. Her real name, her real service record, her real rank, which was several pay grades below what she had claimed. It detailed the nonprofit, the donations, the speaking engagements, the fabricated BUD/S graduation. It included quotes from 3 unnamed sources within the special operations community who described her deception in terms that were polite enough for print but carried the weight of controlled fury. The article did not go viral in the way celebrity gossip goes viral. It moved through specific channels, military forums, veteran Facebook groups, law enforcement circles, fraud investigation networks. It moved through the world of people who care about these things, and in that world, it detonated. Comment sections filled within hours. Veterans who had met her posted their own accounts. People who had donated to her nonprofit demanded refunds. Event organizers who had put her on stages released statements distancing themselves from her with the panicked energy of people trying to outrun a fire they did not start but are now standing downwind of. She disappeared. Not dramatically. Not the way people disappear in movies with packed suitcases and midnight flights to countries without extradition treaties. She disappeared the way ordinary people disappear in the age of the internet. She deleted her social media accounts. She stopped answering her phone. She vacated her apartment, and she became a ghost in a world that was suddenly very interested in finding her. The nonprofit was shut down by state regulators within 3 weeks. The financial audit revealed what everyone suspected. The money had not gone to supporting women in special operations. It had gone to her rent, her car, her wardrobe, her travel expenses to the events where she collected more money. There was no program. There was no mentorship infrastructure. There were no grants or scholarships or any of the things the donation page promised. There was a woman with a website and a bank account and a story good enough to keep the deposits coming. The total amount was not enormous by fraud standards. Low 6 figures spread over nearly 2 years. Enough to live on, not enough to get rich. She had been playing a long game for modest stakes, which suggested that the money was never the primary motivation. If it had been, she would have scaled up faster, taken bigger risks, pushed harder. She would have incorporated in multiple states, applied for government grants, leveraged the connections she was making into larger and more lucrative opportunities. She did not do any of that. She kept the operation small and personal and intimate. She went to events. She shook hands. She told stories. She looked people in the eye and let them see what they wanted to see. The money was a byproduct. The real currency was the identity. That distinction mattered, though not in the way she might have hoped. It mattered because it pointed to something deeper and more troubling than simple greed. Greed is easy to understand. Greed has a logic to it. You want money, you take money, you spend money. What she had done was more complicated. She had stolen a life. Not a wallet, not a bank account, a life, an identity forged in suffering and sacrifice, an identity that real people had paid for with their bodies and their minds and in some cases their lives. She had taken that and wore it like a costume to a party. The veterans community understood this distinction instinctively. This was why the reaction was so intense and so sustained. It was not about the money, though the money made it criminal. It was about the desecration. The trident is earned through a specific kind of suffering, a voluntary suffering that strips away everything comfortable and familiar and leaves only the essential question: will you quit or will you continue? Every person who wears that trident answered that question under conditions designed to make quitting the only rational choice. They continued anyway. And the bond between them is built on the shared knowledge that every single one of them made that same irrational choice at the same impossible moment. She had not made that choice. She had never been asked to make it. She had skipped to the end of the story and claimed the reward without paying the price. And the people who had paid that price felt it like a physical violation. Like someone had walked into their home and rearranged the furniture and claimed they had always lived there. The legal consequences unfolded slowly, as legal consequences tend to do. The state attorney general's office opened an investigation into the nonprofit fraud. The IRS launched a separate inquiry into tax irregularities. The military community cooperated fully, providing documentation, financial records, screenshots of communications, and testimony from dozens of people who had interacted with her over the 2-year period of the deception. She was eventually located in another state, living under a variation of her name with a new job in a civilian industry that had nothing to do with the military. She had cut her hair. She had stopped wearing the tactical clothing and the trident pins and all the external markers of the identity she had constructed. She looked different, smaller somehow. The confidence that had been her most effective tool was gone, replaced by the hunched, averted gaze posture of someone who knows they're being watched. When contacted by investigators, she cooperated. That was unexpected. People who build elaborate deceptions typically fight the unraveling with the same energy they put into the construction. They deny. They deflect. They construct new lies to protect the old ones. They hire lawyers who specialize in making things go away. She did not do that. She answered questions. She provided financial records. She explained, in detail that surprised the investigators, exactly how she had built the deception and exactly how she had maintained it and exactly how much money had passed through the nonprofit and exactly where it had gone. She did this not out of guilt or not entirely out of guilt. She did it because she was tired. The deception had been exhausting. Maintaining a false identity is not a passive act. It is a constant, active performance that requires vigilance at every moment. Every conversation is a minefield. Every new person is a potential threat. Every question might be the one that pulls the thread that unravels everything. She had been living like that for 2 years, and the base visit had been a moment when the effort finally exceeded her capacity. She told the investigators that the lie had started small. She said she had been in a bar after leaving the military, still wearing her veteran status like a warm coat in cold weather, and someone had asked her what branch. She said Navy. They asked what she did, and something in her, some impulsive, reckless, desperately unhappy thing, said the words. Special operations. 2 words. That was all it took. The reaction was immediate. The person's eyes widened. Their posture changed. Their voice dropped into the reverential register that civilians use when they encounter someone who has done something extraordinary. And she felt for the first time in longer than she could remember seen. Not seen as who she was, a mid-ranking veteran with an undistinguished service record and a growing collection of disappointments. Seen as who she wanted to be, who she felt she should have been, who she would have been if the world had been arranged differently, if she had been born at a different time, or in a different body, or with a different set of circumstances. That feeling was the drug, not the money, not the access, not the free meals, or the handshakes, or the standing ovations at charity events. The feeling of being seen as extraordinary. The feeling of walking into a room and watching it rearrange itself around her, watching people sit up straighter and listen harder and treat her words like they contained something precious. She had been ordinary her entire life. Not bad, not unsuccessful, ordinary. The kind of person who fills out the middle of the bell curve, who does competent work and earns competent pay and lives a competent life that nobody will remember or write about or make a movie about. She had served her country and done it adequately and come home to a world that said thank you for your service and then forgot about her before the sentence was finished. The special operations claim changed everything. It made her story worth telling. It made her presence worth requesting. It made her a person who mattered in rooms where she had previously been invisible. She had not planned the fraud. She insisted on that. And the investigators were inclined to believe her, not because they trusted her, but because the pattern supported it. The nonprofit came later, months after the initial lie, when the momentum of the deception created opportunities she had not anticipated. People wanted to give her money. People wanted to support her cause. She had not asked for it at first, but when it appeared, she took it, and once she took it, she could not stop taking it without exposing the entire structure. That was the trap of the lie. It demanded escalation. Each layer of deception required another layer to support it, and each new layer created new obligations and new risks and new opportunities that demanded still more layers. The nonprofit funded the wardrobe, that funded the appearances, that funded the connections, that funded the credibility, that funded the nonprofit. It was a closed loop, a perpetual motion machine powered by trust and sustained by the willingness of good people to believe in someone who told them what they wanted to hear. The investigators filed their report. The state attorney general brought charges: guide fraud, mail fraud, misrepresentation in connection with charitable solicitation. The charges were serious, but not spectacular. She was not going to prison for decades. She was going to court and then probably to a period of supervised release with restitution requirements, and then to a life permanently marked by what she had done. The court proceedings were brief and unremarkable. She pleaded guilty. The judge accepted the plea. The sentence was pronounced. She stood in the courtroom in civilian clothes with her hands clasped in front of her and her eyes fixed on a point on the wall above the judge's head, and she absorbed the sentence the way she had absorbed everything else in this process, with the dull resignation of someone who has already done the harder work of confronting what she had become. The restitution amount was set based on the documented donations. She would be paying it back for years. Every month, a portion of whatever she earned would go to the people she had deceived, a slow drip of accountability that would follow her through jobs and apartments and whatever life she managed to construct on the other side of this. The court proceedings made the news again. A second round of articles, shorter than the first, noting the guilty plea and the sentence. The comment sections filled again, though with less heat this time. The community had already processed its anger. What remained was a colder, more permanent thing. A cautionary tale that would be referenced every time someone new was caught faking military credentials, a data point in the ongoing war between imposters and the communities they prey upon. But the story did not end in the courtroom. The story ended, or rather continued, in the places where its damage had been done. The retired officer who had brought her onto the base resigned from the veterans organization he had helped build. Not because anyone asked him to, not because anyone blamed him. He resigned because he could not stand in front of a room full of veterans and ask them to trust his judgment after his judgment had allowed a fraud to walk among them. He went home to his house in Virginia and spent more time in his garden and less time answering his phone, and when people asked him about what happened, he said as little as possible, which was its own kind of penance. The young woman in the dorm room, the college junior who had been training for a military career in special operations, she kept training. She ran farther. She lifted heavier. She swam longer. She did not quit. She did not let the betrayal become an excuse to stop. Instead, she used it the way anger is supposed to be used, as fuel. She channeled it into her preparation and her application, and When she eventually stood at the starting line of her own selection process, she carried with her the knowledge that the woman who had inspired her was a lie, and that the inspiration, paradoxically, was real. Because the imposter had been right about one thing. The one thing that matters in special operations, the one thing that separates those who make it from those who do not, is the refusal to quit. And the young woman had learned that lesson from fraud, and the lesson was still true, and the truth of it did not care where it came from. That was the cruelest irony of the entire story. The imposter had spent 2 years teaching people about resilience and determination and the refusal to surrender in the face of impossible odds. And she had taught it well, and the people she taught it to carried those lessons forward into their own lives, and the lessons worked. She had been a brilliant teacher of virtues she did not possess, a convincing preacher of a gospel she had never lived. She had described the fire without ever being burned by it, and her descriptions were so vivid and so detailed that people who listened to them felt the heat on their own skin and believed it was real. And perhaps in some strange and uncomfortable way, it was real. The information was accurate, even if the source was fraudulent. The principles were sound, even if the person articulating them had never tested them. The courage she described was real courage, even though she had only observed it from the outside, studied it like a biologist studies an organism under glass, fascinated, envious, forever separated by the barrier of the lens. The base returned to its routines. The memorial service for the fallen operator happened on schedule. The golf tournament fundraiser raised more than expected. New trainees arrived and began the process of being broken and rebuilt. The obstacle course was used. The climbing ropes were climbed. The cold water was entered and endured. The silence that had fallen over the base on that Tuesday afternoon eventually lifted, replaced by the normal sounds of training and operations and the daily business of defending a country. But it left a residue, a thin layer of wariness that settled over every interaction with outsiders, every visitor's pass, every introduction from a well-meaning retired officer who wanted to bring someone onto the base to inspire the troops. Trust had been damaged, not destroyed. The community was too strong and too resilient for that. But damaged in the way that a bone is damaged by a fracture. It heals. It functions. It might even be stronger at the break point than it was before. But the person who carries the healed bone always knows it was broken. They feel in the cold. They feel it when they move a certain way. They carry the memory of the break in their body long after the bone has mended. She was not the first person to fake SEAL credentials. She would not be the last. The community had dealt with imposters before and would deal with them again. There were websites dedicated to exposing them, databases of verified graduates, informal networks of veterans who spent their spare time investigating suspicious claims. The infrastructure of verification existed because the problem existed, because the trident attracted pretenders the way gold attracts thieves, not because the trident is valuable in a material sense, but because it represents something people want to possess without earning. But she was different from most imposters, and the community knew it. She was different because she was not a random civilian with a fantasy. She was a veteran. She had served. She had worn the uniform and taken the oath and lived the life, just not the version of the life she wanted. She was different because her deception came not from ignorance of the military, but from intimacy with it, not from a lack of service, but from a dissatisfaction with the service she had given. She knew enough to be dangerous. She knew enough to be convincing. She knew enough to get onto a base full of the most elite warriors in the world and sit in their conference room and look them in the eye and tell them she was one of them. And for a few hours, on a gray Tuesday morning, she was. Not really. Not in any way that mattered. Not in the way that the men in that conference room were the men who had survived Hell Week and combat deployments and the particular loneliness of a life spent in the shadows. Not in any earned or authentic sense, but in the sense that she had stood among them and spoken their language and shared their space and breathed their air, and for one brief, impossible morning had lived inside the identity she had built from stolen parts. In that sense, she had been there. She had tasted it. And then the questions came, and the silence followed, and the taste turned to ash. The base moved on. The community moved on. The young woman in the dorm room graduated and began her own military career. The retired officer eventually returned to volunteer work, older and more careful. The donors got some of their money back and learned a lesson about verification that they wish they had not needed to learn. And somewhere in another state, under a variation of her name, a woman who had once pretended to be extraordinary went back to being ordinary. She went to work. She paid her restitution. She kept her head down and her mouth shut, and she did not talk about the military or special operations or the Trident or any of it ever to anyone. At night, alone, she sometimes thought about that conference room, about the faces of the men who had looked at her with professional courtesy before the questions started and professional certainty after. She thought about the retired officer's face in the dining facility when he came back from the phone call. She thought about the gate guard who took too long to check her out. She thought about the highway and the base shrinking in her mirror and the silence that had followed her off the installation and into her car and down the road and into her life. That silence never fully left. It lived in the pauses between her words when people asked about her past. It lived in the way she avoided certain topics and certain places and certain types of people. It lived in the gap between who she had pretended to be and who she actually was, a gap that had once been filled with performance and was now filled with nothing. She had wanted to be extraordinary. She had wanted it with the deep, aching, irrational want of someone who believes they were meant for something greater than what they got. And in the absence of actual extraordinariness, she had manufactured it. She had built it from research and rehearsal and the raw materials of other people's suffering. She had worn it and displayed it and profited from it, and for a while it had worked. Then she walked onto a base where the real thing lived and breathed and trained and fought, and the real thing looked at her and saw through her the way light passes through glass, completely, instantly, without effort. The base went quiet that day. It went quiet the way a forest goes quiet when something unnatural enters it, when the birds stop singing and the insects stop buzzing and everything holds still and watches until the intruder is identified and expelled. She was identified. She was expelled. The birds started singing again. And the base, that strange and sacred place where ordinary people are transformed into extraordinary ones through a process of suffering that most human beings cannot imagine and would not volunteer for, went back to the work of making warriors. It did not need her story. It had its own. The real ones always do.